What's the best Australian movie ever made? If you're a fan of the post-apocalypse, your answer might just be Mad Max, director George Miller's marauding motorist mania, celebrating its 45th anniversary in 2024. Never mind the billion-dollar franchise it spawned, and the countless genre stories it influenced, the creative ingenuity and low-budget DIY filmmaking of the 1979 original makes the movie one of the most impressive feats in cinematic history. A true independent movie with a rebellious spirit, Mad Max was made in just 12 weeks for a few $100,000 and went on to generate record profits. And it introduced the world to a young Mel Gibson who would go on to become a bona fide Hollywood action star. As the legacy of the wasteland continues with Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga, it's a good time to check the rearview mirror and look back at what the f*** happened to Mad Max.
People don't believe in heroes anymore.
I know, McAfee, you want to give them back their heroes.
Mad Max was George Miller's feature-length film debut, following his time working as an emergency room doctor in Sydney, Australia. Miller grew up in rural Queensland and experienced the loss of several close friends dying in violent motorcycle collisions. And during his days working in the ER, he often witnessed the types of fatal road injuries seen in Mad Max. In 1971, Miller enrolled in film school and met fellow filmmaker Byron Kennedy, who would go on to share screenwriting credit with Miller for Mad Max. The duo made a short film titled Violence in Cinema Part 1, which proved to be a semi-blueprint for Mad Max. Miller also hired newspaper editor James McCausland to flesh out the script. Despite making his first feature, Miller had a clear vision to create a visceral, hyperkinetic, silent movie with sound, inspired by the storytelling techniques introduced by silent film pioneers like Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd. With zero screenplay experience, Miller focused on the action scenes and overall structure, while McCausland concentrated on dialogue and subtext, using the 1973 Australian oil crisis as inspiration for the movie's crumbling society. Miller also found inspiration in the 1975 Don Johnson post-apocalyptic movie A Boy and His Dog, based on a Harlan Ellison story. However, Miller later admitted that the movie's dystopian atmosphere was not part of the original screenplay, but was born out of necessity. Due to the small budget, Miller could not afford many extras or well-maintained buildings, so instead he opted to place the story in a desolate and deteriorating civilization, with the opening title card implying it occurs after a world war or other catastrophe. Miller and McCausland presented a 40-page treatment to the Australian government, which funded most of the film. They also raised money by performing medical house calls, with the former treating patients and the latter driving. The filmmakers ultimately raised around $400,000 to make Mad Max. When the time for casting approached, Miller considered choosing an American to play Max Rocketansky in an effort to broaden the movie's appeal. After venturing to Hollywood to recruit, Miller backtracked when realizing that a recognizable American actor would be too costly. By design, Miller hired unknown actors to play roles, so viewers would not be distracted by familiar faces from previous projects. The first choice to play Mad Max was Irish actor James Healy, who rejected the script due to its sparse dialogue. Once Healy declined, the casting director considered new grad students from Australia's National Institute of Dramatic Art, searching for spunky young guys to play various roles. 21-year-old American-born actor Mel Gibson wowed the filmmakers during his audition and was cast as Max Rocketansky while still a drama student, earning $15,000 for his performance. Meanwhile, Gibson's friend and school roommate Steve Bisley, who had encouraged Gibson to audition for the film, was cast as Max's affable MFP colleague Jim Goose. Miller had also been inspired by the 1974 biker exploitation movie Stone, and hired several actors from the movie, including Vincent Gill, Roger Ward, and the menacing toe cutter himself, Hugh Keys Byrne, who went full method for the role, shaving an eyebrow and patterning his performance on conqueror Genghis Khan. Of course, while the toe cutter meets a messy fate, Keys Byrne would later reunite with Miller to play Fury Road's imposing tyrant, Immortan Joe. Principal photography on Mad Max began in November of 1977, originally planned for a 10-week shoot but extending to 12. Unfortunately, just 4 days into filming, actress Rosie Bailey was injured in an accident and was replaced after a 2-week production delay by Joanne Samuel as Max's wife, Jessie. The majority of the film was shot in the outback around Melbourne in Victoria. Miller chose to film Mad Max in a widescreen anamorphic format, shooting the entire movie using a 35mm lens that had been discarded by director Sam Peckinpah for his 1972 film The Getaway. A labor of love in every sense, Mad Max reflects the manic, anti-authoritarian energy of the production techniques themselves. Described by Miller as true guerrilla filmmaking, shots were flat-out stolen by mounting cameras to the tops of cars, closing roads without legal permits, and capturing footage in areas forbidden by the authorities. For example, the first scene filmed involved actor Tim Burns, who plays impetuous gang member Johnny the Boy, busting the chain on a locked emergency phone. Burns appears rushed because Miller lacked the legal permission to film the scene and raced to capture the footage before the actual bronze could arrive. The death-defying filmmaking methods perfectly embody the spirit of the movie, with driving scenes captured at full, terrifying speeds and typically performed by the cast themselves. Cinematographer David Egby would shoot while laying on the hood of an accelerating car or sitting on the back of a motorcycle without a helmet while the vehicle rocketed across the asphalt at over 100 miles an hour.
Before we continue with our video, here's a reminder to click the Store tab on any of our JoBlo channels and browse our collection of the latest and freshest designs in our merch store. Go get you some.
Miller and his crew avoided using walkie-talkies in order to remain undetected by police scanners, and they often cleared road wreckages by themselves after filming crash scenes. Ironically, Miller's attempts to avoid the authorities backfired when the actual local police became interested in the production and assisted the filmmakers by escorting vehicles and shutting down roads to accommodate the filming. As a first-time filmmaker with a restricted budget, Miller unsurprisingly faced numerous problems early on, even getting so bad that he quit the project. Producer and co-writer Byron Kennedy then asked fellow Aussie filmmaker Brian Trenchard Smith if he would take over directing duties, but Trenchard Smith instead advised them to hire a talented first assistant director. Miller forged ahead and completed the film with Ian Goddard stepping in as first AD and safety coordinator. To Goddard's credit, for such a brazenly renegade production, no road accidents occurred while filming. That doesn't mean there weren't several intentional crashes, with 14 vehicles deliberately destroyed for the crash and chase sequences by the end of filming, including several of the motorcycles donated by a local Kawasaki dealer who had actually expected to get them back in working condition. For the blue van in the opening pursuit scene, the engine was removed, and the vehicle weighed so little that it chaotically spun out of control on impact, accentuating the explosive spectacle. For gearheads especially, it's hard to discuss Mad Max without mentioning the killer cars seen on screen. The police cars in the film are actual decommissioned police vehicles that were more affordable than the alternative. Max's yellow Interceptor was a former Victoria police car, a tuned-up 1974 Ford Falcon XB. One interesting detail is the name of Rocketansky's unseen road partner, the Dark One, stamped on the side of the Interceptor. And while the character was cut from the movie, he's briefly referenced by Max, and is supposedly who Goose is gruesomely describing in the opening diner scene.
Sitting there trying to scream with his face ripped off.
Max's black V8 Pursuit Special was a 1973 Ford XB Falcon GT 351, a limited edition hardtop model discontinued in 1976. These badass road burners are among the most iconic movie cars ever constructed and helped popularize Mad Max when it raced into theaters. Knight Rider's infamous death crash was filmed using a military-grade booster rocket installed in the back of a tricked-out 1972 Holden Monaro. The car was meant to collide with a trailer of fuel barrels, but instead it sped out of control and flew off the road, zooming into a nearby field for a quarter mile. The graphic explosion of Knight Rider's demise was filmed separately using a towed car under safer conditions. One memorable scene involves Jim Goose giving a three-wheeled cyclist a get-out-of-jail-free card, which was a sly in-joke among Miller and his cast and crew. Several of Toe Cutter's gang were actual members of the Vigilantes, a Melbourne motorcycle club. Because of their authentic appearance, the real-life bikers were often discriminated against and treated poorly in town. Since the gang members drove themselves to the set each day, as a precaution, Miller gave them each written letters to present to police officers in case they were pulled over, literal get-out-of-jail-free cards. The small budget and lack of resources necessitated all kinds of cost-cutting measures. For instance, no stunt doubles were used during the physical scuffles, and the actors performed the fights themselves. May's rural home was an abandoned farmhouse that had to be furnished by the filmmakers with their personally owned items. For the costumes, only Mel Gibson wore genuine leather, with other cast appearing in much cheaper vinyl outfits. And when Max handcuffs Johnny the Boy in the famous final scene, plastic toy cuffs were used, despite Max claiming they're made out of high-tensile steel. Johnny's grim predicament would later inspire fellow Aussies James Wan and Lee Whannell for the ghastly climax of their horror debut, Saw. Once principal photography wrapped, Miller and Kennedy edited the film over 4 months in their friend's apartment in North Melbourne, actually cutting the film on a homemade editing machine that Kennedy's father engineered for them. Another unforgettable part of Mad Max is the gothic musical score, arranged by Australian composer Brian May, not to be confused with the Queen guitarist. Miller instructed May to create an ominous Bernard Herrmann-style score, reminiscent of classic Hitchcock movies. Miller had become a fan of May after hearing the score for the 1978 Aussie horror movie Patrick. Mad Max was initially banned in New Zealand due to the scene where Goose was burned in his vehicle, which unfortunately mirrored an actual recent gang incident in the country. When the movie was prepared for release in the US, all the dialogue was dubbed over by American actors because the distributor feared that the original Australian accents would be too difficult to understand for American audiences. Fortunately, the original audio was later restored for DVD releases. With its high-octane action and astonishing stunts, Mad Max was a smash success in theaters, grossing over $100 million and setting a Guinness World Record for the most profitable film in 1979, a title it retained for 2 decades, until getting dethroned by low-budget phenomenon The Blair Witch Project in 1999. The success of George Miller's primal revenge thriller launched his illustrious directing career, helped propel star Mel Gibson to the A-list, and put Australia on the map as a cinematic power player. But the enduring legacy of Mad Max and its sequels has been the undeniable influence on the vibe and aesthetic of countless futuristic societies that followed, with motorhead madmen, tactical fetish gear, barren plains, and adrenaline fury all becoming synonymous with stories set in the post-apocalypse. And thankfully for fans of jaw-dropping road action and outrageous characters, George Miller continues his Mad Max saga in 2024 with Furiosa, chronicling the early days of Fury Road's fierce imperator. Even after 45 years, Miller is not willing to leave the wasteland behind, and we're grateful that our fuel tanks have been filled by his unique vision of the end of the world.